Glory to Jesus Christ, and welcome to this week's episode of God with Us Live. Every week, we're joined by men and women, monastics, clergy, and laity, exploring exciting and inspiring ways to live our Eastern Catholic faith today. Your host is Father Deacon Nick Medelsky, a husband, father, and deacon of the Ukrainian Catholic Eparchy of St. Nicholas. And now, here's Father Deacon Nick.
Hello and welcome once again, God with Us Live listeners. Father Deacon Nick Medelsky, excited as always to be here with you to talk about wonderful things going on in our Eastern Catholic churches. If you've been following social media recently, you might have noticed a lot of Eucharistic processions taking place throughout the U.S. You may have even seen things about the National Eucharistic Revival, the Eucharistic Congress coming up in Indianapolis, and a lot of other Eucharistic things going on. In fact, even our parish here in Minneapolis, St. Constantine, we were able to be one of the stops on the National Eucharistic Pilgrimage making its way in our part of the United States from Lake Itasca down to Indianapolis. So slightly familiar, but I know a lot of our listeners might not be 100% familiar. But figured this would be a good way for all of us to learn a little bit more about this Eucharistic revival and especially how we fit in as Eastern Catholics. And there's a really exciting event coming up at a Byzantine parish in northwest Indiana. And we'll be talking about that with the pastor of that parish, Father Andrew Summerson, as well as the guest speaker at that event, Mike Aquilina. And I happen to have both of those men with me here today on God with Us Live. And we'll let both of you guys introduce yourselves. So, Mike, how about you go first?
Well, my name is Mike Aquilina. I'm a writer with a special interest in early Christianity. I've written a number of books. I'm a husband and father and grandfather, and I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay, Father Andrew?
Hi, I'm Father Andrew Summerson, and I am a Byzantine Catholic priest of the Ruthenian Eparchy of Parma, but I'm located right around here in Chicagoland on the other side of the border in Whiting, Indiana. I am a preacher with a bad habit in theology. I hold a doctorate in patristics. I also teach at the Patristic Institute of the East at the University of St. Michael's College, which is part of the Regis St. Michael Faculty of Theology in the University of Toronto. And I also am a program fellow at the Lumen Christi Institute at the University of Chicago. That's not enough. I'm also happily married to my wife, Laura, who works for Catholic Near East Welfare Association.
And we were able to talk with Catholic Near East Welfare Association before. We had a gentleman from New York on talking about that great work that they do there. And as both of you mentioned, both of you have an interest in studying patristics, which is kind of the study of the fathers of the church. So I guess we'll go with the same pattern we started with. Mike, would you mind telling our listeners why that kind of appealed to you?
Well, when I was a little boy, I read a boy's book that told the story of Heinrich Schliemann and how he discovered Troy and the gold of Troy in particular. And it was full of adventure and daring do and that sort of thing. And, I wanted to be like Schliemann. I wanted to cross the ocean and just put my spade in the earth and come up with some gold. Then I found out that archaeologists really had to work hard. And it was dirty work in the heat. So since then, I've done most of my excavating in books. I love reading the works of Christian antiquity. I put my spade in the dirt, and I always turn up gold.
That's awesome. And I loved reading those stories too. Howard Carter with the Tomb of Tutankhamun and Schliemann with Troy. So I can absolutely understand that. Father, how about you?
I was baptized Byzantine Catholic when I was 14 years old. So I'm a Christian and a Byzantine Catholic not by birth or by baptism and by choice.
By rebirth.
And exactly. And I've been catching up with that train that hit me ever since. And so I really just desperately wanted to know everything about the strangeness of the strange church that I was baptized in, so I wouldn't be a stranger anymore, because that's a really unfortunate place to be. And the way in which I went about doing that was really through study, undergraduate on, and just figured out pretty quickly that to make sense of what I was praying, what makes sense of how to communicate this to people, I really need to turn to the Fathers, because that's the core of our theology, with the core of our spirituality and our liturgy. So that's why I do what I do.
Very well put. Very well put. Mike, a lot of people, there was sort of a trend, I guess, at least this is what we learned in our classes, and it may or may not be accurate, but our classes for the diaconate, that study of the Fathers had kind of fallen off over the years in the Roman Catholic Church, and that it was right around, the 20th century and into the Second Vatican Council that the interest and study of the Fathers themselves really kind of gained momentum again. And there are also people today who say, why wouldn't I just study Scripture, or why wouldn't I study writings of more recent saints who lived in, closer times to the times we live in now, or catechisms, things like that? Why bother studying the Fathers, these men and women even who wrote, centuries ago? Why would we still bother to look to them instead of, for example, simply studying Scripture itself, or going through, I don't know, another saint like Thomas Aquinas, or maybe even one more recent, like the writings of recent popes even? Why would we bother to study the Fathers themselves?
Well, if you start with the Catechism of the Catholic Church, or if you start with St. Thomas Aquinas, if you want to go back 8 centuries, you're going to encounter the Fathers. Thomas is utterly dependent on the Fathers. He quotes St. Augustine more than he quotes any other source outside sacred Scripture. The Catechism of the Catholic Church quotes St. Augustine more than any other source outside of sacred Scripture. So the Fathers are, you're going to encounter the Fathers if you start with those more recent sources, those more recent theologians and so on. But you're going to miss a lot, because you'll be getting the Fathers not in context, but kind of cherry-picked. When you get into the Fathers themselves, they really come alive on the page. When you get into that history, you get that imaginative entry into a world that's much different from our own, and yet to a church that looks exactly like the church we have today, or looks a lot like the church we have today. The Fathers are just lovable. I mean, if you think about history, it's like a great sieve. Time is like a great sieve, and it lets through, for the most part, the things that deserve to survive. When we're talking about the Fathers, we're talking about just maybe a couple hundred authors out of the thousands of authors who lived during the first 750 years of the Church's life. So we're getting the best of the best and the best. They, just in order to preserve those writings, they had to be copied out by hand at great expense and great effort, because there was no means of reproducing these. And then they had to be preserved, and they had to be recopied many times, sometimes in a single generation, because they were writing with materials that didn't last for very long. So the Church went to great effort to preserve these writings because our ancient ancestors considered them that important. Once you get into those texts, again, it's a different world, and it's all of these great minds that you're encountering. Hans Urs von Balthasar, who's a Western theologian of the last century, was immersed in the Fathers. And when he read them, he saw greatness, depth, boldness, flexibility, certainty, and a flaming love. The virtues of youth, he said. And these qualities make them wonderful to read. These are the men who were most in love with Jesus Christ in their times and could articulate that love in a way that's compelling.
And kind of as a follow-up to that, maybe you could share just a little bit here, because I know we'll keep talking about the Fathers as we move through this interview. But for someone who wanted to kind of start looking to the Fathers outside of simply, like you mentioned, the quotations that you find in the Catechism of the Catholic Church or other kind of secondary or tertiary sources. I'm not sure. I'm not enough of an academic to know the correct term there. But outside of that, if someone wants to engage more directly and more deeply with the Fathers, how would you recommend that they even start that?
Well, there are a couple of ways you could do it, a couple of different approaches. One is you could just dive immediately into the primary sources. And if you do, I would recommend that you start with the earliest sources. Start with the Apostolic Fathers, Clement and Ignatius and Polycarp. these are wonderful writings from really the first generation after the apostles, and you read these masters, and you find that they are, as I said before, in love with Jesus Christ, and they speak of that love in ways that are fascinating, and that draw you in, and that really invite imitation. So I'd start with them. Start with the apostolic fathers, and those are the earliest of the fathers. That's one way of approach. Another way of approach is to get an overview. If you want to find kind of a secondary source, that's an introduction to the fathers. And I'm quite fond of Rod Bennett's book called Four Witnesses, and then he did a sequel called Four More Witnesses. And Rod takes the words of the fathers themselves and kind of fashions them into an imagined story. Rod is a novelist, and so he fashions short stories really out of the words of the fathers themselves. He uses their words as their dialogue, and that's another way of gaining an imaginative entry into that time. So whatever way you do it, you do what works for you.
Thank you for that advice, because I know a lot of people hear that term, the fathers of the church, and it's kind of a nebulous term. And Father Andrew, I was going to ask you if you could comment a little bit on how a lot of Eastern Catholics and Eastern Christians, especially Byzantine Christians, might already be familiar with some of the writings of the fathers and not even realize that through some of the things we do every week, every day in our worship as Byzantine Christians, that actually puts us in touch with the fathers already.
Yeah, Vespers and Matins is simply just the fathers remixed, nipped up and turned into hymns for us to not just listen to, but also to put our mouths around. We can open our mouths and out falls the words of the fathers in every hymn that we sing in Vespers and at Matins as in our church. Nag your priest until he does it. That's a noble way to make sure you get more fathers in your diet. So that, and if you do have that fortune of having Vespers or Matins in your diet, then you're already really getting an industrial strength dose of the fathers, and you might find once you start reading the fathers, the text, they actually know more than you think you know. Because there it is, sort of collected for us and curated for us in the liturgy. Apart from that, obviously, we have the Tropare and the Cantaciat that you would know through the liturgy. We have the Hymn of the Incarnation that is attributed to Justinian, one of the great emperor theologians. Usually we don't let our politicians dabble in our theology, but in Justinian's case, it works to our advantage. And it's attributed to him, although it might be Severus of Antioch, but I like to consider it Justinian's. Anyway, these are just really privileged places to begin one's journey that we can do in common with each other when we worship together.
And I think that's something that's always captivated me because I was raised Roman Catholic, and then later on came in touch with the Eastern churches and eventually became Ukrainian Catholic. And obviously as a deacon now, I'm kind of, bought and sold at this point. But I've always been amazed looking at our hymnography, how much of it is didactic, I guess is the word. It's teaching, it's expounding on a lot of the things we read in Scripture, a lot of the feasts we celebrate, and that it's actually good theology too. I remember I was really surprised in our deacon formation classes at first when our professor was referencing Cantacia and Troparia in a theological lecture, and I had never really thought of them in that way before. I thought, oh, well, these are nice hymns, these are nice ways to reflect on the feast, but I never really thought of them as quote-unquote hard theology, I think, until I got further into it. And then, like you said, the more it's like the fathers of the church remixed, right? It's a lot of different snippets from here and there and all mixed together and like geared to what we're celebrating that day, that weekend.
Yeah,
right?
To your point, Nick, Gregory Nazianzus in our tradition is called the theologian. We don't use that term lightly. It belongs only to John the Evangelist, whom we call the theologian, and Gregory. First evidence we have is in the 5th century, at the Council of Chalcedon, And even his biographer, that first reference to him, suggests that he's only a theologian in the style of John. So really, he's just a good interpreter of Scripture. And so Gregory becomes this sort of privileged voice that interprets the Scripture for us and interprets feast for us. One of the hymns that probably everybody knows if you're a Byzantine Catholic is the Paschal Canon at Resurrection Matins. This is the resurrection day. Let us be enlightened by this feast, right? I mean, this entire canon is attributed to John Damascene, but it's really just a paraphrase of Gregory the Theologian's first Paschal oration. Same thing at Christmas. Christ is born, glorify him. Christ from the heavens go out to us. That's Gregory's oration on the Nativity. I mean, he's this privileged voice. If he's not the best theologian, he at least knows how to say it the best. and that's
the most well-spoken.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to take a quick break here to learn about our Saint of the Week with Diaconissa Maria here in a second, but stay tuned through the break, and we'll be back here on God With Us Live to talk more about the National Eucharistic Revival and what the Fathers of the Church have to do with it. So stay tuned here on God With Us Live.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Scenes with the Saints. Do you know which sleepy saint grew closer to Christ by serving others? Saint Dorotheos lived in 6th century Palestine and was a model student in his youth. He read so much and so intently that he could not be distracted by his friends, nor would he even stop to eat lunch. When the school day ended, he would go home, eat supper, pray vespers, and then light a lamp and keep reading until midnight. When Dorotheos entered the monastery, he was eager to study virtue with the same intensity. One of his first jobs at the monastery was to greet and care for visitors. Dorotheos met people from all walks of life, facing different temptations and struggles. However, the nature of his work meant that he was often busy at all hours of the day and night and found little time for sleep. He asked one of the monks helping him to wake him up for prayer, and another one to make sure he didn't fall asleep during services. St. Dorotheos wrote, "Believe me, I revered and honored them as though my salvation depended upon them." Eventually, St. Dorotheos was also placed in charge of the infirmary at the monastery. Facing the same lack of sleep and time for quiet prayer, he got frustrated and felt he was not truly following the path to holiness. He thought about leaving the monastery to go into the desert as a hermit. But first he asked 2 holy hermits, Saints John and Barsanuphius, for their advice. They both told St. Dorotheos that his work at the monastery was already drawing him closer to Christ, as without love of God and love of neighbor, growth in the spiritual life is impossible. Indeed, over time, many of the other monks began to notice and admire St. Dorotheos' example of patient love, and many of them sought his spiritual advice. Several years later, the abbot of the monastery passed away, and St. Dorotheos took this as a sign that he should go into the desert and become a hermit to live a life of quiet solitude. However, it wasn't very long before some of the same monks sought out their beloved Dorotheos, and he was forced to begin a new monastery. Around this time, he also began writing down the advice he had received from the spiritual elders of his time, as well as his own advice to the monks. His writings are filled with the advice that he had received from Saints John and Barsanuphius all those years ago. Without the love of God and the love of neighbor, the spiritual life is impossible. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Scenes with the Saints. Join us again next time when we learn more about the lives of these holy men and women.
Welcome back, God With Us Live listeners. Father Deacon Nick Medelski here with Mike Aquilina and Father Andrew Summerson. In the first half of the show, we were talking about the Fathers of the Church, that kind of nebulous term sometimes we hear. And we realized that the Fathers are a lot more accessible, I think, than a lot of people actually realize, and they are worth studying, important studying. And as I mentioned at the start of the show, though, we're specifically speaking this program about the Fathers of the Church in the context of something that's going on now, within the broader Catholic Church here in the United States, and also the Eastern Catholic churches are involved here and there. But first, I think we should start out with maybe the grand overarching thing, and then go to the more particular involvement of the Eastern churches. So, Mike, would you mind telling us about the National Eucharistic Revival, what it is, and why now?
Well, I think it's a response to a situation that we have in the United States, but not only in the United States. I suspect it's the same circumstance through much of Europe. That there's been a decline in Eucharistic faith. There's been a decline in the faith of the Church. People have not been catechized adequately. They don't know what the Eucharist is. They don't know what the liturgy is, and so they don't go. They don't go. And as they just continue living without that sense of the rhythm of the Church's life, their faith dwindles. They're not fed, and they begin to die spiritually. So the bishops of the United States have decided to revive Eucharistic faith, and they've really put together an extraordinary effort over the last couple of years, and it's going to culminate in this Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis. So right now, there are, I think, 4 different groups who are processing really in pilgrimage through the United States. Really starting from the Four Corners and processing toward the middle of the country to Indianapolis. And they'll be coming through my very town and my very parish in a little bit. So I'm looking forward to that. And this is just a way of bringing people in contact with Jesus once again in this way, to light a fire under us. And it's going to be an extraordinary event. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to the aftermath.
That's not something people often say. I'm looking forward to the aftermath, but
yeah,
I think in this case,
yeah,
it's merited, I believe. Father, one of the questions I think I get asked most often, especially as this Eucharistic revival is taking place here in the United States, is obviously Eucharistic exposition and adoration aren't really organically a part of our tradition as Byzantine Catholics. Some other Eastern Catholic churches have something similar, but especially for us who have the Constantinopolitan tradition, it's not really organically, I guess, a part of our devotion, our rite. So, would you mind commenting maybe a little bit on, I guess, why it's not really a part of our tradition, and then B, since a lot of this Eucharistic revival, a lot of the things going on with it involve, for example, Eucharistic processions, Eucharistic adoration, how do Eastern Catholics fit into the grand scheme of this?
We have everything to offer, and it's actually our charge as Eastern Catholics to offer our sense of reverence for the Eucharist, to say that we don't have a Eucharistic piety is just sort of fallacious on its face. I mean, I just went through a pretty wonderful experience of Lent, and if you're on the old calendar as a Ukrainian Catholic, you had it a little bit sooner than I did, and I processed through the church on Wednesday and Friday nights at pre-sanctified liturgy, and my people fall prostrate on their faces because they've been fasting and praying and preparing themselves. Just a couple things. I mean, 2 very important things. First, Second Vatican Council, the document on the Eastern churches, Orientalium Ecclesiarum, tells us that Eastern Catholics have a portion of divine revelation that's peculiarly their own, that is meant to be shared with the wider church. Think for a second what we mean when the church talks about divine revelation. Go to another document of the Vatican Council, Dei Verbum. Revelation is God's self-communication to humanity. Now, if we have a portion of revelation, a portion of God's communication to humanity, that the church's proclamation of revelation is at best incomplete and at worst incoherent. So as we're trying to revive our sense of the Eucharist, if we don't play our part as Eastern Catholics in the United States, it's going to be a real impoverished revival. And so this is, where we come in that regard. And then another piece that I think is also very practical that Mike alluded to, there's been a decline in understanding of the true presence and significance of the Eucharist as source and summit. As a Byzantine Catholic Church, when we were going through the Synod on Synodality, the eparchy conducted a really well-run set of surveys about basic Catholic practices run by the Catholic Leadership Institute. And one of the places that our eparchy and parishes came out ahead on, when you look at the raw data, is our reverence and understanding for the Eucharist. We were much ahead of the national average that this survey suggested. So I think in some sense we have a greater awareness of Eucharistic piety and reverence around the sacraments. And that's something that we can give and offer to maybe a portion of the church that might be more forgetful or amnesiac about it. We're here to assist in the church's memory. And if the church loses her memories, there's a way in which she ceases to be herself. So we give a part of that back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, bringing it back to the first part of the interview, part of the event that's happening in Whiting is, of course, Mike, you're speaking about the Fathers of the Church. And I was just curious if you could comment a little bit. We'll talk about the particulars of the event here in a second, but what studying the Fathers has to do with the Eucharistic revival. We just mentioned briefly here what the Eastern churches can offer for this Eucharistic revival. What can studying the Fathers of the Church offer as people go through this Eucharistic revival?
Well, when you read the Fathers, you see that the Eucharist was ubiquitous. It was everywhere in the life of the early church, and it was central to the life of the early church, and it was that way from the earliest generations. You read Ignatius of Antioch, and what's he writing about? He's writing about the Eucharist as the flesh of the Lord and as God's blood. He sees the real presence, what we call the real presence today, and he presents it in very graphic terms. And it's there from, as I said, the first generation. Clement of Rome is much concerned about the proper conduct of the Eucharistic liturgy. That's why he's writing to the people of Corinth, to correct them because they'd kind of gone astray on in the practice of liturgical piety. And so you see this again and again in the Fathers. You see it everywhere, and that's one thing that I want to present in my talk in Whiting, Indiana, is just that this was a major concern. It was the major concern of the early church. And it was central to their discourse in every generation, and this is something that I think we should bring to mind for our own generation. The Fathers are worthy of imitation in these matters.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. So I had mentioned earlier on, Father, that our church, St. Constantine's here in Minneapolis, was able to be one of the stops on the National Eucharistic Pilgrimage, and your parish in Whiting is also going to be a stop, but you're going to have more of an event planned around it as well. So could you tell us a little bit about how that came to be in the first place, and kind of some of the details involved there?
Yes, I think we're actually receiving the same pilgrimage route that came through your parish as well, and
Yep.
and the way in which I tend to do things is any worth overdoing. And so we were simply asked, not by my eparchy, to take on a station on this pilgrim route, but just sort of recognizing where we're located. Whiting, Indiana, we're pitched 10-minute walk from Lake Michigan, half-hour drive from downtown Chicago, and we're in a real historically significant area that's very densely populated. It's a tight little town, 2 square miles. Half of that is BP oil refinery. The other half is stuffed with houses, so it's flanked on one. It's also full of churches. We're one of 4 Catholic churches. We're the only Eastern Catholic church in all of Whiting. And this was a real opportunity to kind of summon our common love for the Eucharist and demonstrate the faith of this community and offer that to the wider public. So we're engaging our brothers and sisters in the 3 Roman Catholic churches. It's actually the entryway into Indiana, so the Diocese of Gary is involved. This is going to be their big kickoff event for 5 days in the Diocese of Gary, and by Catholics from all over Northwest Indiana, all over Chicago, Eastern and Western. Bishop McClory of the Diocese of Gary is going to be joining us and leading us in procession, but he and I, and in particular, he's really leading the way, wants to make sure that, our church is represented. That is the Eastern Catholic tradition and all this. We're going to be praying in the Eastern tradition. We're going to have a very respectful procession. Won't expose the Eucharist per se, but it's going to be gathered around in that spirit, and we're going to have the church day opened all day for prayer. And I can think to gather not just us in prayer, but gather our minds and hearts around our shared tradition and the fathers of the church. So that's why we invited Mike Aquilina to join us and speak a little bit about that shared tradition with the Eucharist in the spirit of the fathers of the church to sort of guide our evening. The evening will end up on the lakefront of Lake Michigan after the procession's over, and we will find ourselves beneath the pavilion of Whiting Lakefront Park, where we'll have a nice party for everybody to join in on.
Cool, very cool. And your parish is the one that also does the part of the big theophany blessing, right, on Lake Michigan? Is that your parish as well?
I bless things all the time, Deacon Nicholas, but I'm always blessing and eventing. So yes, July 1st, just to mention, is the Eucharistic procession and our portion of the Eucharistic revival that's coming to Whiting, Indiana. We also bless Lake Michigan every year right around the Feast of the Theophany, and I'd be remiss if I didn't speak of yet another blessing that we'll be a part of, which is we bless the largest event in the state of Indiana after the Indy 500, which is Pierogi Fest. Happens right now.
Yes.
Come to Whiting, Indiana. And it started as a church festival, so we're here to reclaim it for Jesus. And we're going to do that in a real special way by declaring Sunday Catholic Day at Pierogi Fest. We're inviting the Hillbilly Thomists. They're going to be everybody's favorite Catholic bluegrass band, Dominican priests. They're going to be joining me at the altar, our outdoor shrine altar on Sunday for our Divine Liturgy. Parking's free. If you come to liturgy before, afterwards, we'll all walk up the street and we'll hear the banjos strum, and it'll be a really great day for us, for Whiting, and for Catholics who, want to make it the delightful summer treat that is a steamed and fried and buttered pierogi.
And what are the dates for Pierogi Fest?
Pierogi Fest goes from July 26th through the 28th. It's the last weekend in July. But July 28th, which is the Sunday, will be Catholic Day at Pierogi Fest.
Very cool, very cool. And Whiting also has, for New Year's, at least I've seen a few years, the pierogi drop for New Year's. So a very pierogi-centric town there, which is appropriate for Slavic Christians, right?
Yeah. Pierogi Fest was the impetus for Pierogi Drop, which is, now we make all things pierogi. So,
and that's a good place to be. Once again, that special event there at St. Mary's Byzantine Church in Whiting, Indiana, will take place on July 1st. You can go to St. Mary's website at stmarywhiting.org and find out all the information there on the Eucharistic pilgrimage. Just looking through the schedule here, the church will open at noon for prayer with confessions. Mike, you'll speak at 6 p.m. It looks like the procession will be at 6:30 with Eucharistic benediction with Bishop McClory at 7:30 at the park, and 7:45 food, fellowship, music, and dancing on the lakefront. Sounds like a wonderful event. If you're at all in that area or have the chance to visit, it sounds like it will be a great event. Well, thank you so much, Father Andrew and Mike, for joining me today on the podcast. Do either of you have any final thoughts?
I'm excited about working with Father Andrew again. I'm a great admirer of his work, his scholarship, and I consider him one of the great teachers today in our country. So this is a privilege for me. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Wow. Well, thanks, Mike. That's precisely why I invited you, because I think the same. So there you go. Join us on July 1st, and we'll continue the Love Fest in Whiting.
The Pierogi Love Fest in Whiting, Indiana. Well, once again, thank you so much, Father Andrew Summerson and Mike Aquilina, for joining me today on God With Us Live. And thank you, all of you, for listening today to God With Us Live. It's always a pleasure to bring you this program. Again, if you have any past episodes you'd like to listen to, you can find us at godwithusradio.org, godwithusradio.org, and that'll take you to our website, the different podcasts we host there. And of course, you can always find us on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube Music, and all the other places you like to find podcasts. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today here on God With Us Live. God bless.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of God With Us Live. Make sure to tell a friend or two about us and subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to follow God With Us online on Facebook and Instagram for even more great content about the Eastern Catholic Churches. And don't forget to check out all the other great Eastern Catholic podcasts at godwithusradio.org, where faith meets life. God With Us Live is a production of God With Us Radio, hosted, produced, and edited by Nick Modelski. Send us a message at info@godwithusradio.org.